Last week, a court ruled that Google has an illegal monopoly in the advertising industry. Meantime, Meta still in the midst of its own antitrust case with the FTC. Joining us right now for more on this administration's regulation, Jonathan Cantor, former Assistant Attorney General of the Antitrust Division under President Biden, is also a CNBC contributor, and we welcome him to the show this morning. Before we get into the Meta case, I'm curious what your reaction was to the Google scenario. I imagine you're happy about it. But I'm curious if you were surprised in terms of the fact that this administration continued with that case, and what you think the ramifications are now going to be in terms of what they're going to ask for.
Yes. Hi, Andrew. Yes, I'm happy. No, I'm not surprised. And so this was a big victory for the Department of Justice and antitrust enforcement. I brought this case to break up Google's ad tech monopoly. These are the pipes and plumbing that sell ads everywhere on the internet. And it was a decisive victory for the DOJ. And in terms of the administration, there are a few things in Washington right now that can bring people together. Antitrust enforcement happens to be one of them. And antitrust enforcement against big tech happens to be perhaps the only thing in Washington that Democrats and Republicans can agree on.
In terms of what you think the remedy in the Google case will be, not should be, but will be.
Yeah, so I think there are two Google cases. There's the ad tech case and the search case. On the ad tech case, the one that we just won, that was about Google competing on the buy side, the sell side, owning the exchange in the middle, and then buying and selling on its own exchange. The only remedy that I can see is forcing Google to divest one side or the other at least. And then getting out of the exchange business. I think that's what we asked for in the case. I think that's what ultimately.
Do you see a bigger breakup? The reason I'm going to this is, do you see a bigger breakup happening in tech under this administration? Meaning, if the search case continues the way it's going to, do you see a moment where all of a sudden Google gets broken up and Meta gets broken up? Because that's what we're really talking about here.
Yeah, I think it's a realistic possibility that we're going to have our AT&T moment for big tech and antitrust. You have 3 cases now and 2 others in the pipeline, all that have breakups as a possibility. But to be very clear about it, breakups aren't necessarily bad for the businesses. To the extent they have to divest a few pieces here and there, it actually may unlock a lot of value and I think be very good for our economy. I mean, some of these companies, we could see the Mag 7 become the Mag 8 overnight if they divested significant assets.
What do you make of the Meta case? And I'm curious also what you make and what you know about what we heard about in that Wall Street Journal article last week about Mark Zuckerberg's efforts to try to settle that case with Trump in advance.
I'm glad that the case was not settled at the White House. These are law enforcement actions. They should be handled with the appropriate degree of independence by the agencies. In terms of what I make of the case, I think the FTC has exceeded expectations thus far. The case is ultimately going to come down to whether you view social graphs and friends and family networks as competitive with performance and content graphs like TikTok and YouTube.
If, in fact, both of these companies are effectively established as monopolies and whatnot, how much influence does this administration and the White House have on what the DOJ does to effort remedies?
Yeah, so in our administration, those efforts of law enforcement would be handled independent of the White House. Law enforcement, there was a very significant wall up between the DOJ and the White House. I think those walls have come down in this administration. So potentially there will be influence, but thus far it appears that the administration is keeping hands off.
Look, they're pardoning Carlos Watson. So I ask because I can't imagine. Maybe I'll be wrong. Maybe I'll turn it to be vastly wrong. But the idea that both Google and Meta will get broken up during the Trump administration, I think would be a big surprise to a lot of people.
Well, it very well might be a surprise, but that's the path that's going down. I mean, the FTC is bringing this case to break up Meta, and DOJ is heading into court to force Google to divest its Chrome browser. So all systems are go.
Do you have any concern or worry that these cases are so backward-looking and that the future is so very different, and that when you look at the competitive landscape today, it is nothing like what it was a decade ago or even 5 years ago, and that when you think about AI and you think about TikTok and you think about all the other companies that are out there, the Chinese companies that are competing in these spaces, and just the relevance of these companies, that somehow we're missing the boat here?
Antitrust enforcement is most important at times of inflection points in technology. And so what you want is the incumbents having to compete their way into the next generation of technologies, not to use their heft and dominance to block new competitors. The fact of the matter is Google's search is still dominant, notwithstanding ChatGPT, and Google's search advertising is still super dominant in the US and worldwide. The remedies need to be forward-looking. They need to make sure that new AI companies, new advertising companies, new businesses have the opportunity to unseat Google, Meta, Apple, Amazon, and others. And that's what these cases are about. The remedies, if they're going to be effective, have to be forward-looking and preserve the next generation of technologies.
Okay, two more quick questions. One is tariffs changes the competitive landscape, potentially. I wonder whether you think it changes the sort of market at which you'd start to look at some of these companies.
Yeah, I mean, listen, we are in a world of industrial policy now, and we are more isolationist. And so making sure that we have resilient supply domestically is more important than ever. And so absolutely, I think it only reinforces the need to make sure that we have competition domestically. We are at our best when we are more like the U.S. and less like China. And we are more like the U.S. when we have a competitive economy with opportunity rather than having national champions with command and control.
And then finally, big law. It is the topic du jour here in New York about the Trump administration's settlements with some of these firms, and now new concerns inside these firms just about what they're going to have to do to make good on whatever those settlements were. And then, of course, obviously, there's a whole number of firms that haven't settled. When you sort of play out the dominoes of this, and if a firm decides, if Paul Weiss decided, look, we're actually not going to help the administration work on X, Y, Z, and then somehow the Trump administration would take on these law firms or to try to put them in a position where they can't represent folks against the government in the future in certain kinds of cases, how do you think the courts would play that out? What do you think the Supreme Court would do, and how would it all work?
Yeah, let me just say, I think it's terrifying that you have the administration trying to nationalize our nation's law firms and put them to work for the nation. Law firms are supposed to defend the government from overreach, not contribute to it. And so this is for all lawyers, this should be a very terrifying moment. And it is for me, certainly. Ultimately, how do I think this plays out in the courts? I don't think the executive order targeting law firms without any investigation or any proof of violating the law will hold up at the Supreme Court. And so I think these law firms would be wise to defend themselves, defend the rule of law, and defend the principle that they are there, in fact, to defend Americans, private citizens, and companies from government overreach.
But if the Supreme Court rules that the executive orders are not, in fact, legal, does that undo the settlements that the Skaddens and Simpson-Thatchers and Paul Weisses and others made?
It very well might not, and that's why they shouldn't have done it, because they should have waited for this to play out in the courts. Most of the law firms that are fighting, I think all of them, have now received temporary restraining orders, meaning the executive orders are not in effect, and they have the ability to fight this out. There's going to be a question about whether the settlements are binding contracts, and that will withstand Supreme Court scrutiny.